The galaxy was old, older than most species could properly imagine. It had seen stars born and die, had watched civilizations rise from nothing and collapse into dust, and had quietly kept its secrets the way only something truly ancient could, not by hiding them but by simply waiting for someone to ask the right question. Soren Kaz had always asked too many questions. His people, the VTH, considered this a mild character flaw, not dangerous, not shameful. She's just slightly inconvenient, the way a leaking pipe is inconvenient. You notice it, you sigh. You work around it. His teachers had noted it. His parents had tried to correct it. His superiors at the Galactic Conclave had learned eventually to simply hand him assignments where curiosity was at least partially useful. He was 26 cycles old, which made him young by VTH standards and practically ancient by the standards of some of the shorter-lived species who sat on the conclave floor. Hattie had pale gray skin, large dark eyes that caught light the way polished stone catches light, and a habit of tilting his head to the left when something did not make sense to him. On this particular morning, his head was tilted very far to the left. He was sitting in the navigation room of the diplomatic vessel Eternal Accord, and he was staring at a star map. The Eternal Accord was a beautiful ship. It had been built 3 centuries ago by the Kith shipwrights as a gesture of galactic unity, a all-smooth white hull and long sweeping lines with rooms decorated in the styles of a dozen different species. It carried ambassadors, diplomats, and aides from across the conclave to and from the annual summit, which was held at a rotating location each cycle. This cycle, the summit was being held at Varath Station, a neutral platform hanging in empty space between 3 different star systems. Soren Cass was not an ambassador. He was a junior aide, which meant he carried documents, organized schedules, fetched refreshments, and was generally expected to be invisible. He had been doing all of these things competently for 2 cycles now. He was good at his job. Invisibility part, however, he sometimes struggled with. He had come to the navigation room because the route on the central screen had caught his eye. As he passed the open doorway, he had stopped. He had looked, and then he had stepped inside because the route on the screen had a small section of it that seemed to his eyes slightly wrong. The Eternal Accord was taking a long arc around a particular region of space, a very long arc, the kind of arc that added several extra days to the journey. Soren Kaz had looked at the direct route, the obvious, logical straight line between their current position and Varath Station, and could not understand why they were not taking it. He had pulled up the navigation interface and simply started exploring. He had not touched anything. He had only looked, but what he found as he looked was a pattern that did not make sense. Every route in the ship's memory, every pre-plotted course for every destination within a certain region of the galaxy curved around the same area. It was not marked on the official charts as a hazard zone. There were no noted anomalies, no recorded debris fields, no warning flags. It was just empty space, a wide region of stars and systems that every charted route in the Eternal Accord's navigation database carefully, it consistently avoided. Cena's tilted his head. He did what any curious person would do. He pulled up the region and looked at it directly. It was large, much larger than he had initially realized. It covered dozens of star systems, hundreds of inhabited worlds, an enormous sweep of the galaxy's inner arm. It had a name, though the name was not prominently displayed. It appeared only in small text in a corner of the chart, as if whoever had labeled it had not wanted to draw attention to it. When the label said human space, Soren Cass had heard of humans every species had in the vague and distant way that one hears of something without ever quite learning the details. They existed in the background of galactic knowledge the way certain old stories exist. Everyone knows the title. No one can quite tell you what happens in them. He had never met one. He was not sure anyone he knew personally had met one when he could not recall a single lesson from his schooling that had focused on them specifically. He had, however, heard the phrase that every young VTH child eventually heard from an older relative or a tired teacher when asking one question too many about something they should not be pursuing. You do not go there. He had always assumed it meant something metaphorical, a lesson about certain dangerous neighborhoods of space, perhaps radiation zones, contested territories, the kind of place pirates operated from. He looked at the navigation interface again. He looked at the direct route to Vera Station. He looked at the small section of it that clipped just barely the outer edge of the region marked human space. He did not touch anything. He only looked, but behind him the door slid open and Navigator Polaris walked in. A tall Keth woman with silver markings along her neck and the expression of someone who had seen a child about to touch a hot stove. She crossed the room in 3 quick strides and closed the navigation display so fast that Soren Cass actually stepped back. The silence that followed was long and specific. It was the kind of silence that carries weight. I was only looking, Soren Cass said. Pelly's did not answer immediately. She stood very still, looking at the now blank screen, and her expression was something Soren Cass could not immediately name. It was not anger, it was not irritation, it was something older and quieter than both of those things. Go back to your duties, she said. I didn't change anything. I was curious about the route. Go back to your duties, aids Soren. He went, but he looked back once as he left, and what he saw stopped him for just a moment. The doorway. Polaris was still standing at the navigation console, is still looking at the blank screen, and her hands were pressed flat against the surface of the console, not gripping it, just pressing as if she needed to feel something solid. Her eyes were closed. Soren Cass went back to his duties, but the question stayed with him the way questions always stayed with him, sitting behind his eyes, waiting. Summit began 3 days later. The Eternal Accord docked at Vareth Station, alongside 11 other diplomatic vessels. We and the Great Hall of the station, filled with the noise and color of 17 different species attempting with varying degrees of success to be polite to each other. Soren Cass moved through the crowds with his data pad and his schedule, invisible in the way that junior aides are invisible, present enough to be useful, unimportant enough to be ignored. He delivered documents. He confirmed meeting times. He fetched a specific type of mineral water for the Dreth ambassador, who would drink nothing else, and who expressed his thanks in the form of a grunt that Soren Cass had learned after 2 cycles to interpret as genuine appreciation. In the evenings when the official sessions ended and the ambassadors retired to their private quarters. Soren Ka sat in the common room and read. He had found, in the station's public archive, collection of old trade route records. Not historical records, not academic papers, just practical, boring documents about shipping lanes and travel times. He read them the way another person might read a mystery story, looking for patterns, looking for the thing that did not fit. He found it everywhere, every shipping lane, every trade route, every recorded journey between major systems in the inner arm of the galaxy bent around the same region, some of them bent so dramatically that the detour added weeks to journeys that should have taken days. There was no official explanation in any of the documents. The routes simply curved. They had always curved. The records went back centuries, and the curve was there in all of them, consistent and unquestioned. The way a scar is consistent, you stop noticing it. After a while, he started asking questions. He was careful about it. He did not ask the ambassadors, who would either not answer or would have him reassigned. He asked the other junior aides, the clerks, the station workers. When he asked in the way that seemed casual, conversational, as if he was simply making small talk, most people said they did not know what he was talking about. Some of them said it in ways that made it clear they did know exactly what he was talking about and had decided not to discuss it. A few of them, the older ones, the ones who had worked in galactic politics for a long time, got a look in their eyes that Soren Cass was starting to recognize. That same quiet, he closed off expression that Navigator Pelly's had worn. Not fear exactly, something like the memory of fear, something that had been carried for so long it had become part of the furniture of the mind. On the fourth evening of the summit, he found himself in the station's small public garden, a room with real soil and real plants brought from a dozen worlds, which always smelled strange because of it. Sitting beside the Uran ambassador's personal secretary, a very old Uran named Thessus, who smelled of spiced tea and had been working in galactic diplomacy for longer than Soren Cass had been alive. They sat in comfortable silence. For a while, Thessus was one of those people who did not need to fill silence with words, which Cenas appreciated. "Can I ask you something?" Cenas said. "Eventually, you can ask," Thessus said, which was not the same as saying he would answer. "Human space," Cenas said. "And why does everyone go around it?" Thessus was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at a small blue plant, his feet a trailing thing with thin leaves that moved slightly in the recycled air. "How old are you?" Thessus said. 26 cycles. Thessus was quiet again. "When I was young," he said at last, "my grandmother told me a story. She said that once, a very long time ago, the year had sent a survey ship into that region, a small ship, a scientific vessel. There were 7 crew members." Soren Cass waited. "The ship came back," Thessus said. "The crew was fine, healthy, unharmed." He paused. "But they would not talk about what they had seen, any of them. For the rest of their lives, they would not speak about it. They would leave the room if it was brought up. One of them, the captain, burned all of his personal logs from that journey." "What did they see?" Thessus picked up the blue plant and set it on his knee, looking at it. "No one knows," he said. "That is the point of the story, I think." He set the plant back down. "You do not go there, young Soren Cass. This is not a rule that anyone Made, it is a rule that simply is the same way that you do not put your hand into fire, you do not need a reason. Written down somewhere, you simply do not do it. Cenas looked at the plant. 2. But the crew came back fine, he said. They came back silent. Thesis said that is not the same as fine. He stood up slowly, much with the careful movements of someone whose joints had begun to complain, and walked out of the garden without another word. Soren Casa sat alone with the plants and the strange mixed smell of a dozen different worlds, and his head tilted slowly to the left. On the last day of the summit, something happened that made every conversation he had been having feel suddenly very small. He was crossing the main corridor of Varith Station, a wide, high-ceiling hall with transparent panels in the roof that showed the stars outside, when he heard a commotion near the communications hub at the far end. Not a loud commotion, not shouting or alarms. Something quieter and more unsettling, the sound of a large number of people going very still all at once. He moved toward it because he always moved toward things rather than away from them. In the communications hub, a cluster of diplomats and aides and station workers were standing around the main display. On the screen was a map, star chart, and on the chart was a single moving signal, a ship's beacon. And the ship's beacon was crossing a line that every person in the room recognized, a Dree vessel, a radar by the look of the beacon's class signature, moving through the outer edge of human space. No one spoke. Soren Kaya stood at the edge of the group and watched the faces of the people around him. He saw the KTH ambassador, who was one of the most composed beings he had ever observed, standing with his arms at his sides and his jaw very tight. He saw 3 different species representatives who had never in his experience agreed on anything, all standing close together, as if instinctively seeking company. He saw Navigator Pellies near the back of the room, and her face was the same as it had been 3 days ago in the navigation room of the Eternal Accord. Not afraid. Something older than afraid. The beacon moved. It crossed the line. It went deeper. The room watched. The beacon moved and moved, and then it disappeared. The room stayed silent for a very long time after that. Sin Casa stood among them, watching the blank space on the chart where the beacon had been, and felt something shift inside him. Not fear. He could not quite reach fear yet, because he did not know enough to be afraid of the right things. What he felt was something else, the particular sensation of standing at the edge of something very large and very deep, and looking down and understanding for the first time that you are standing at an edge. He looked around at the faces of people who had known about that edge for their entire lives, who had been raised knowing about it, who had built their careers and their trade routes and their political systems around it carefully, without ever looking at it directly. He looked at the blank space on the chart. He thought about 7-year scientists who had come back silent. He thought about a galaxy of species, ancient and advanced and powerful, all quietly, carefully, consistently going around the same piece of space for centuries, without anyone ever writing down a proper reason why. He thought about the word that was never quite used, but always present, the word that hid inside phrases like "you do not go there" and "looks like the one thesis" had given the blue plant, as if looking at something small and familiar was easier than looking at the larger thing behind it. The word was fear, and standing in that room watching people who governed star systems and commanded fleets standing close together like children in the dark. Soren Cass understood for the first time that whatever was inside that region of space was not a bedtime story. It was not a metaphor. It was not a scar so old that no one remembered the wound. It was real, and somewhere inside it a Darth Vader's beacon had just gone dark, his head tilted to the left, his hands were very steady. He was going to find out what was in there. He did not know yet that the answer would not be what anyone expected. He did not know that the fear which had kept an entire galaxy walking in long, careful arcs for centuries, Ash was built on something that no species had quite managed to look at straight. He did not know that the truth behind the silence was stranger and more humbling than any monster could have been, but he was going to find out. He always did. Beacon stayed dark for 3 days. 3 days was not a long time in the life of the galaxy. Stars burned for billions of years. Civilizations rose over centuries. If political disputes between species sometimes ran for generations before anyone bothered to resolve them. 3 days was barely a breath, but in those 3 days the silence from inside human space sat over the galactic community like a held breath. People who had never cared about a Darth Vader in their lives found themselves checking the long-range sensor reports. The conclave, which had been in its closing sessions and preparing for departure, Amri quietly extended the summit by 2 days with no official explanation. Everyone knew why. No one said it out loud. Soren Cass barely slept. He had in those 3 days learned more about the missing Dreth vessel than he had any official reason to know. He had used his access as a summit aid, which was technically only supposed to allow him into meeting rooms and catering schedules to quietly wander into conversations and listening to people who forgot he was there. He was good at that. He had been good at it since childhood. The ship was called the Hard Luck, which Soren Cass thought was either the most honest name for a Dreader or the most ironic one. She was a mid-sized vessel, old, with a crew of 9. Her captain was a Dreth named Vorak, who had a history of small-scale piracy in the outer systems. Nothing serious enough to bring the conclave's enforcement fleets down on him, just enough to keep himself and his crew alive. She had been traveling through the boundary region between galactic open space and human space when she crossed the line, whether she had crossed it by accident or by desperate necessity, fuel running low, engines failing, some emergency forcing the closest available route. No one knew for certain. The Dreth ambassador at the summit, a heavy-set being named Garrow, who wore his military decorations even at diplomatic events, had gone very quiet when the beacon disappeared. When he had not made any public statements, he had not demanded a rescue mission. He had, according to the aide who handled his schedule, canceled all his remaining appointments and spent the next 2 days alone in his quarters. That told Sinos everything he needed to know about what Dreth military leadership thought the Hardluck's chances were. On the morning of the second day, a few of the more aggressive voices in the conclave's lower chambers had begun talking about a retrieval operation. He did not get far. The elder ambassadors, as the Keth, the year the old Thessal representatives who had been part of galactic politics for longer than most species had been space faring, shut the conversation down with a speed and a unity that was itself remarkable. These were beings who disagreed on nearly everything. They agreed on this without hesitation. No, one was going into human space, not for 9 Dreth pirates, not for anyone. Soren Kaz sat in the common room on the evening of the second day and watched the elder ambassadors and tried to understand them. They were not cruel beings. The KE ambassador Leth Naren had spent 40 years working on refugee resettlement programs. The year representative, Old Thesis Direct Superior, had brokered 3 separate peace agreements in his career. These were not beings who left people to die casually, and they left people to die when the alternative was something they considered worse. That told Soren Kaz something too. He sat with that thought and turned it over in his mind. The way he turned all his thoughts over, looking at them from different angles. What was worse than 9 people dying? What could be bad enough that beings of good conscience would choose it without hesitation? The only answers he could think of were something very large or something very unknown, or both. But he was still sitting with those thoughts when the alert came. The beacon reappeared on the morning of the 3rd day. Soren Kaz was in the communications hub when it happened. He had taken to spending his free hours there on the pretense of updating the conclave's travel records, and the station workers had gotten used to him being in the corner with his data pad. When the signal appeared on the main chart, he was close enough to see it before anyone else reacted. When the hard luck had come out the other side, not from where she had gone in, she had entered human space through the boundary, the edge closest to galactic open space. She reappeared at the far boundary, the deep boundary, the far interior edge, thousands of light years away. She had traveled in 3 days, a distance that should have taken weeks. She had traveled deeper into human space than any recorded vessel in living memory, and come out the other side, and she was broadcasting. The room filled up fast. In less than 10 minutes, every senior diplomat on Vareth Station was in or around the communications hub, and the signal was being routed through the main speaker so that everyone could hear. Soren Kaz stood very still in his corner and listened, because nobody was asking him to leave. The voice that came through the speakers was Vorax. Soren Kaz had never heard it before, but there was a quality to it that he recognized immediately, because he had been listening for that quality for 3 days. It was the voice of someone who had seen something they did not have words for. Yet not a panicked voice, not a traumatized voice, not even a frightened voice. Exactly, it was a stunned voice. Deeply, completely stunned. The voice of someone who had built an entire internal picture of the world and then been shown gently and thoroughly that the picture was wrong. The transmission was looping. It had been looping for some time before they picked it up, which meant Vorak had been broadcasting it continuously since the moment the hard luck cleared the boundary. He was not stopping to think about what he was saying. He had already thought about it. He was just saying it over and over, because perhaps saying it over and over was the only way to start believing it. We went in, Vorak's voice said. We had no choice. Drive failure. We needed the closest road. We crossed the line. Hey, we knew what we were doing. We accepted it. A pause. They found us within minutes. Dozens of ships, not like anything I've seen. Big. Very big. They surrounded us completely. We had no weapons that would have mattered, so we didn't try, we just waited. Another pause, longer this time. They hailed us on our frequency. They knew our frequency. They spoke breath. Not well, not perfectly, but enough. They asked why we had come. We told them. Drive failure, emergency, we needed passage through, and we offered everything we had. Cargo credits, the ship itself if they wanted it. The room was absolutely silent. Soren Cass could hear the ventilation system humming. Overhead, they said no. Vorek's voice continued. They said they didn't want our things. They asked about our drive. What was wrong with it? Our engineer explained. One of their ships came alongside us. A technician came aboard. She fixed the drive in 4 hours. She didn't ask for anything. She just fixed it. A very long pause. Then they gave us a route, a safe route all the way through. They told us which systems to avoid, which lanes were clear. They guided us the whole way. Their ships stayed close but not threatening. When we got to the far boundary, their lead ship hailed us again. The voice cracked slightly, not breaking, just bending. The captain of their lead ship. I don't know her rank. I don't know her name. She said, travel safely and next time. And we'll send a message first. We would have come to you. The transmission looped back to the beginning and started again. No one in the communications hub spoke for a long time. Soren Cass watched the room. He watched the elder ambassadors. He watched Lethnarin, who was standing with his arms crossed and his eyes on the floor with the expression of someone doing complicated arithmetic in their head. He watched the Dreth ambassador Garo Subber, who had stopped not speaking and was now standing near the speakers with an expression that Soren Kaz could only describe as undone, as if something inside him had been built on a foundation that had just quietly dissolved. He watched Thesis, who was standing near the back of the room and who, when he felt sour and Cass looking at him, met his eyes for a brief moment. Thesis looked tired, not surprised, just very, very tired. The transmission spread faster than the conclave could contain it, because the conclave, it turned out, did not move as fast as a looping broadcast on an open frequency. By the time the senior staff had a meeting about controlling the information, the signal had already been picked up by a dozen relay stations across the region and passed along by every civilian operator who had happened to be monitoring that frequency, which was many because everyone had been monitoring everything for 3 days. Within a standard day, the galaxy knew not all at once but in pieces, the way things always spread, first to the people who were paying attention, then to their contacts, then outward in rings. Like a stone dropped in water, Soren Cass tracked it the best he could from Ver Station. He read the public boards, the civilian news relays, the diplomatic dispatches that came through the station's communication system. He built a picture from the pieces. The reactions were varied. On some worlds the news was met with disbelief. The story was too clean, too strange. 9 pirates had gone into the most feared region in the galaxy and come out with their drive fixed and a polite farewell ringing in their ears. It sounded like a dream. It sounded like a story someone made up to make themselves feel better. On other worlds, the reaction was not disbelief, but something more unsettling, a kind of retroactive shame. If humans had simply fixed a broken drive and said travel safely, then what exactly had 3 centuries of careful avoidance been Built on, what had all those long arcing trade routes been about? What had the silence meant in the conclave chambers? The reaction was controlled and careful. On the surface, and something much more volatile underneath, Cenas sat in on 3 meetings he was not officially invited to by the simple method of being very still in a corner with a data pad. In those meetings, he heard the elder ambassadors speak in the formal measured language of people who were managing situation. They talked about information verification. They talked about the need for calm. They talked about the importance of not drawing conclusions from a single incident. What they did not talk about in any meeting was the obvious question: if the hard luck had come out intact, if her crew was fine, if they had been helped, then what had everyone been afraid of? No one asked it. Soren Cass noticed that one of the most powerful diplomats in the galaxy, in meeting after meeting, carefully and collectively did not ask the most obvious question in the room, that more than anything told him the question had an answer, and that the answer was something the people in those rooms already knew. The hard luck docked at a neutral station near the outer boundary 4 days after her reappearance. Vorak and his crew were met by medical teams, debrief officers in Iran, though this was not announced publicly. Representatives from 3 of the conclave's elder nations who arrived on unmarked ships. Soren Kaz was not there. He had no way to get there and no authority to demand access even if he had, but he had by this point developed a network of sources inside the station's communication channels that would have impressed his superiors if they had known about it. He got the debrief summary 2 days after it was filed. It said largely what the transmission had already said. The crew was healthy, no physical harm, no psychological breaks, no trauma markers beyond what you would expect from an emergency situation. Vorak had confirmed the account in person, as had each of his crew members separately. Their stories match completely, not in a suspicious way, but in the way that genuine experiences match when 9 people all live through the same thing. There was one detail in the debrief that had not been in the transmission, one small thing that the debrief officer had noted almost as an aside, as if they were not sure what to make of it. Vorak had said in his in-person interview that during the 4 hours while the human technician was fixing the drive, several other members of the human escort had come alongside the hard luck in small craft and pass boxes through the airlock. Food mostly, some medical supplies, a few items that appeared to be comforts, good quality blankets, kind of drink that turned out to be a warm sweet beverage that none of the Dreth crew had ever tasted before. No one had asked for these things. They had simply been given. When Vorax's engineer had tried to refuse out of pride or stubbornness or simple disbelief, the human who handed the boxes through had smiled. Vorak had described the smile. Some detail, he had been asked to describe it because the debrief officer had noticed that he mentioned it twice. Unprompted, he said it was the smile of someone who was not surprised by the refusal, who had expected it, who was offering anyway, not because they expected acceptance, but because offering was simply what they did. Soren Kaz read this detail and sat very still with it for a long time. He thought about a galaxy that had been afraid of this for 300 years. Makuhi thought about trade routes that curve for weeks out of their way. He thought about 7-year scientists who had come home silent, and he wondered for the first time whether they had been silent from terror or from something else entirely, something that also had no words but for different reasons. He thought about the elder ambassadors in their meetings carefully, not asking the obvious question. He thought about Thesis' tired eyes, and he thought they know something. Not just that humans were not the monsters the silence had implied, something more specific than that, something they had known for a long time and had chosen carefully and consistently not to share. He put down the debrief summary. He had not come this far by being patient, but he was going to need to be patient now, because what he needed was not going to be found in navigation databases or shipping records or the overheard conversations of mid-level diplomats. What he needed was in the deep archives, the sealed records, the documents that the elder nations kept behind permissions that a junior conclave aide had absolutely no right to access. He was going to access them anyway. He did not think of this as a plan so much as an inevitability. The question had been inside him since he had stood in the navigation room of the Eternal Accord and looked at the region marked human space on. The question had been growing since then, fed by Thesis' tired eyes and pale irises, pressed palms, and an undone Dreth ambassador, and a looping transmission that a galaxy had heard and understood wrong because they had been carrying the wrong story for too long. He was going to find the right story. He picked up his data pad. He started making notes. Outside the small window of his quarters, the stars were sharp and cold and very, very old. Somewhere far beyond what he could see, eat him in a region of space that every chart curved around, something patient was waiting, something that fixed broken drives and gave out blankets and smiled at refusals without surprise. He was going to find out what it was. He tilted his head to the left and he began breaking into the conclave sealed archives. Was not the kind of thing that happened quickly. Soren Cass had known this going in. He was not the kind of person who expected difficult things to be easy. He was, however, were the kind of person who believed that difficult things were possible given enough patience and enough willingness to be creative about what counted as a legitimate method. Over the following weeks after the summit ended and the Eternal Accord returned to Conclave Central, which was a sprawling administrative station that orbited the neutral world of Kathmara, he began carefully, quietly building his way in. He started with what was publicly available. The open archives of the Galactic Conclave held centuries of records, meeting minutes, trade agreements, exploration logs, diplomatic correspondence. Most of it was dry beyond description. Soren Cass read it anyway. He read it the way an archaeologist moves Earth carefully, steadily, looking not at the things that were there but at the shape of the things that had been removed. And things had been removed. That was the first thing he noticed. Not records of humans. Those appeared occasionally, brief and strangely thin, the kind of record you would get if someone was being very careful to include just enough to make the absence look like disinterest rather than deletion. But surrounding the human records in the logs of the elder nation's early expansion period, there were gaps, meeting minutes that jumped from one subject to another with no recorded transition, expedition logs that simply ended midjourney with a notation reading classified, level 7. Access diplomatic correspondence between the KE year and Thessalords during a specific century, roughly 400 years ago. That existed as titles in the index, but when opened returned nothing but access. Denied notifications, the gaps were shaped like something. Soren Cass could not see the shape yet, but he could feel the outline of it. He made notes. Well, he mapped the gaps the way you would map a figure in fog, not by looking at the figure, but at the places where the fog moved differently. Then he went looking for people. Conclave Central was a large station. It housed several thousand permanent staff and rotating personnel from across the galaxy, and like all large communities of people doing important work under significant pressure, it had a network of relationships that official structures did not map. People who owed each other favors, people who trusted each other in ways that bypassed the formal channels. Sinos was young and relatively new, but he had 2 cycles of quiet, careful relationship building behind him, and he had spent those 2 cycles being genuinely useful to people in ways that created genuine gratitude. He had covered for a senior researcher who needed a personal day. He had quietly corrected a filing error for an archive clerk that would have caused that clerk serious problems if it had been discovered by a superior. He had on 3 separate occasions located documents that other people had spent hours looking for and delivered them without being asked for credit. These were small things, but small things accumulated. He spent 2 weeks asking questions carefully and listening to the answers. He found a retired year historian named Bess Terrell who had spent 30 years in the deep archives before her eyesight made screen work impossible. She was now 80-some cycles old and lived in a small suite near the station's garden level and had a memory that was extraordinary for its specificity. She could recall document numbers and filing locations from decades ago with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime caring about exactly that. Soren Cass visited her 3 times with tea and questions framed as academic curiosity. By the 3rd visit, she had stopped pretending not to know what he was really asking. The level 7 files, she said on the 3rd visit, setting down her cup with small click. That's what you want. I want to understand the history. Sorena said. You want to understand why the history has holes in it, she corrected. She looked at him steadily. Her eyes were clouded by age, but sharp in the way that eyes sometimes grew sharper as the body aged around them. You are not the first person to want that. You will not be the last. What happened to the others who wanted it? Most of them were reassigned to very boring postings before they got anywhere interesting. She paused. A few who were more persistent and more careful found what they were looking for and nothing in most cases. They read the records. What they understood things better, and they carried that understanding quietly for the rest of their careers because they understood by then why the records were sealed. She looked at him for a long moment. Do you know what the purpose of a sealed archive is? Young Soren Cass, he thought about it honestly. To protect information, sometimes, but more often, she said, it is to protect the people who made the decisions that are recorded in it, from judgment, from accountability, honor, from the inconvenient questions of the people who came later. She stood up slowly. I am going to give you a document number. I'm not going to tell you how to use it, because I genuinely do not know if the access pathways I use still work. I am going to give it to you because I am old enough that the worst they can do to me is make me move to a smaller suite. Well, and because I have been waiting a long time for someone to ask the right questions. She wrote the number on a small piece of physical paper, actual paper, the kind that left no data trail, and handed it to him. Read everything, she said, not just the records about humans, read the records around them. Read what the elder nations were doing and saying in that period. Context is how you understand a document, a record. Without context is just facts. With context, it becomes a story. He looked at the number in his hand. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me, she said. Go find out what happened. The access pathway worked, not easily and not quickly. It took him 3 more weeks of careful navigation through the archive system, using the document number as a key to unlock a linked chain of records that led him through a dozen different classification levels. He did it from different terminals at different times of day. He was careful, he was patient. Therefore, he did not hurry. When he finally reached the core files, he read for 4 days almost without stopping. What he found was not one story, it was hundreds of stories, expedition logs from a dozen different species, earliest spacefaring periods, all from roughly the same era, roughly 8 to 1200 years ago, the Great Expansion period, when multiple civilizations had reached the stars within a few generations of each other, and the galaxy had suddenly become a very crowded place. And in those logs, spread across hundreds of documents from a dozen different worlds and a dozen different languages, one thread appeared again and again. Humans not as monsters, not as warriors, not as the terrifying force that centuries of careful silence had implied. They appeared in these old records the way recurring character appears in a long book, consistent, recognizable, impossible to fully understand, but somehow familiar, present at moments of expansion, of conflict, era of first contact, always there somewhere in the background. The records were fragmented. Some had been partially redacted even before being classified, so that what reached him was already incomplete, but there was enough, more than enough. First full account he read was a KE expedition log from approximately 900 years ago. A survey vessel moving through a star system that they believed was uninhabited had encountered a human ship in orbit around one of the inner planets, and the log described the encounter in careful, almost clinical language, because the K of that era were meticulous record keepers who distrusted emotional language in official documents. The human ship had hailed them immediately on a K frequency in imperfect but functional K language. The survey commander had noted with evident surprise that the humans appeared to have been expecting them, or at least not surprised by them, as if encountering other species was not a notable event. And the exchange that followed had been brief and courteous. The humans had asked about the KE expedition's purpose. The KE commander had explained. The humans had provided detailed information about the system, resources, hazards, orbital mechanics that had taken the K survey team weeks to gather on their own. They had shared it freely without negotiation, without requesting anything in return at the end of the exchange. So the human ship's commander had said something that the KE expedition log had recorded verbatim, apparently because the survey commander had found it strange enough to write down exactly. You're going to meet a lot of us in the coming years. Don't be alarmed. Most of us are reasonably well behaved, the KE commander's personal notes appended to the official log said. I do not know what to make of them. They seem to find all of this, the distances, the strangeness, the danger, ordinary, as if the universe is a place they are comfortable in. Sour and Ka sat with that for a while before moving on. There were hundreds more year records of a colony world where humans had arrived before them, found the planet already, had a small year settlement, and simply set up camp on the other continent. Without conflict, trade had started. Within a year, the year colonists had been baffled by the ease of it. One settler's journal, a private document that had somehow ended up in the archive. Probably because everything got archived eventually. More said they seemed to genuinely enjoy meeting people, like it is something they look forward to. Thessal records of a border conflict from 800 years ago between two Thessal factions that had been quietly resolved when a human mediator had shown up uninvited, sat down with both sides, and produced an agreement in 3 weeks that the factions had been unable to reach in 3 years. The mediator had refused payment. She had left according to the record because she had heard about another conflict somewhere else and wanted to help with that one too. Dreth records, these were harder to read because the Dreth archival language of that era was formal and dense, but Soren Cass worked through them of early expansion clashes that had gone wrong, turned violent, and been met by humans who arrived not as military forces, but as something harder to categorize. They came in the middle of fights and stopped them, not by superior firepower, though the firepower existed. It was mentioned in the Dreth records with a particular kind of careful respect that spoke volumes. By presence, by sheer persistent, patient presence, by refusing to leave until the fighting stopped. One Dreth military commander report from approximately 850 years ago had a line in it that Soren Cass read 3 times. They do not fight like beings who are afraid to die, Aaron. They fight like beings who genuinely believe it does not have to come to this and are frustrated that you are making it necessary. He stopped at that line for a long time. He was starting to see the shape of the thing in the fog. The picture that assembled itself over 4 days of reading was not simple, and it was not entirely comfortable. Humanity in that early expansion era had been everywhere, not in the galaxy-dominating way of conquest or empire, but in the relentless, curious, when slightly exhausting way of a species that had found the universe and decided collectively and individually that they wanted to know all of it. They had shown up in places no one expected. They had inserted themselves into conflicts they had no direct stake in. They had given things away: technology, food, medical knowledge, navigation, data, with an ease that other species had found variously generous, suspicious, and baffling. They had also made mistakes. This was in the records too. Saw early contact errors, cultural misunderstandings that had turned sharp before anyone understood what was happening, moments of human impatience or arrogance, or the particular human tendency to believe they could fix things that perhaps did not want to be fixed. The records were honest about this, at least in the originals. The parts that had been redacted tended to be the parts where humans were shown in a more complicated light, Soren Cass noticed, and then Approximately 400 years ago, something had shifted. The human presence in the records did not end suddenly, it faded, like a signal gradually moving out of range. First the frontier outposts stopped being mentioned, then the neutral zone encounters became fewer. Then the trade route contacts, the chance meetings, the uninvited mediators. Over roughly 50 years the records of human contact became thin, then sparse, then stopped entirely. On the records of what the elder nations did in that same period were some of the most heavily classified documents in the archive, but there were enough fragments, enough slips in the redactions, enough context from the records around them for Soren Cass to piece together something close to the truth. The elder nations, the Keth, the year, the Thessal command had met multiple times at high levels in secure locations. The records of these meetings were largely gone, but the decisions that came out of them were traceable in subsequent policy changes, in infrastructure choices, in how trade routes were mapped. They had decided collectively to let the silence build, not to attack humanity, not to confront them, simply to allow the distance to grow, to quietly discourage contact, to reroute and reclassify and let the legend develop on its own, because a legend carefully tended one was more powerful and more controllable than anything that required active maintenance. A story that children were told and never questioned, a rule that became over generations, a rule without a reason, obeyed purely on the weight of its age. Sorina sat back from the terminal, his eyes arched. He had been reading for 17 hours straight. He understood the shape now. He could see the whole of it. The terror was not something that humans had done. It was something the elder nations had built, quietly, carefully over generations. Because a galaxy afraid of human space was a galaxy that did not expect humanity to solve its problems, did not ask humanity to mediate its disputes, did not send its refugees across the boundary or demand human technology or become dependent on a species that had a complicated and uncontrollable tendency to show up and help. The elder nations had been afraid, but not of humanity, when they had been afraid of needing humanity, and so they had built a wall of silence and let the legend do the rest. Generation after generation of frightened detours and lowered voices, and you do not go there until the original reason was buried so deep that even the elders who maintained the tradition had probably by now have forgotten it, until the fear was genuine, inherited, real, in the way that all old lies eventually become real, because the people carrying them never knew they were carrying a lie. He sat very still with this knowledge. He thought about a Dreth raider and a fixed drive and warm blankets and a smile at a refusal. He thought about 900 years of records of beings who showed up in broken places and tried to help. He thought about Thesis, tired eyes, and the elder ambassadors carefully not asking the obvious question. So when he thought about what Bestel had said, context is how you understand a document. He had the context now. He also had a very large problem, because knowing something and being able to do anything with it were different things. He was a junior aide. He had accessed classified documents using a chain of permissions that he had assembled through methods his superiors would not be pleased to know about. He had no authority. He had no platform. He had no way to put what he knew in front of people who could act on it. he sat with that problem for a long time. Then his data pad buzzed. He looked at it. An incoming message, priority routing, which was unusual because priority routing meant it had been sent with special coding to ensure it reached its destination quickly and directly. The kind of coding you used when you needed something to get through to a specific person without delays. The sender was listed as unknown origin, but the message was short and it was addressed to him by name, his full name, his station designation, his current terminal location. It read, "We have been watching you read our records. Soren Cass, we appreciate the thoroughness. There is a station at the following coordinates. Come when you are ready. We will be there." Below the message was a set of coordinates that his navigation knowledge placed immediately and precisely at the boundary edge of human space. He stared at the message for a very long time. Then he looked up at the ceiling of the archive room as if he could see through it to the stars outside. Then he tilted his head to the left, picked up his data pad, and started figuring out how to get to those coordinates. Getting to the coordinates was not simple. Soren Kaz did not have a ship. He did not have the budget for private transport. He did not have leave authorized because he had not asked for it or because asking for leave while under the quiet watch of 3 different senior officials who were beginning to notice that the junior aide was spending a lot of time in places junior aides did not typically spend time. Would have been at best a conversation he was not ready to have. He solved these problems the same way he solved all problems, methodically, patiently, and by being useful to the right people at the right time. None of the first piece fell into place when a researcher named Olet, a mid-level KETC grapher, who Soren Cass had helped locate 3 missing survey files 6 months earlier, mentioned in passing that she was taking a mapping run along the inner boundary region next week and was short of data entry assistant because her usual one had taken sick. Soren Cass volunteered. Before she finished the sentence, Siddhalat looked at him with the mild surprise of someone who had not expected enthusiasm for data entry, and then shrugged and said yes. The route of Olet's mapping run past, if not close to the coordinates, then close enough that Sauer and Cass could, once they were in the region, make the case for a short detour. He spent the first 2 days of the journey preparing that case, which mostly involved being so quietly indispensable to Alat's work, organizing her data, her catching 2 significant errors in her calibrations, having meals ready when she surfaced from 8-hour stretches of focus work that by the 3rd day she had started treating him less like an assistant and more like a colleague. On the 4th day, he showed her the message. He did not plan to. He had been going to invent a reason for the detour, some technical justification about signal verification or boundary mapping that would get them close enough without requiring explanation. Oh, but sitting across from Olet at the small table, the ship's galley, watching her work and thinking about everything he had read in the archives, he found that he was tired of carrying the knowledge alone. He showed her the message. He told her what he had found. He did not summarize it. He told her the full shape of it, the whole picture, the way best Terrell had told him to read with context. He talked for a long time, so Alat sat very still and listened with the complete attention of someone whose entire career was built around caring about accurate Information. When he finished, she was quiet for several minutes. The elder nations, she said finally, you are saying the elder nations built this. Deliberately, I am saying the archive. Record strongly suggest it, he said. Carefully, I am saying the pattern is clear enough that I do not think it is coincidence. She was quiet again. Then she said in a different tone, slower, more careful, the tone of someone who was adding something personal to an academic conversation. My grandmother was a navigator. She told me once that when she was young she had a colleague who was curious about the boundary. This colleague spent a long time looking into it and eventually was reassigned to a remote survey post. The outer systems, my grandmother said. She had always assumed the colleague had found something dangerous who she had always assumed the reassignment was protective. She looked at the table. Now, I am thinking it was not protective of the colleague. No, Sina's agreed. I do not think it was. She looked up at him. She was a careful woman, precise in the way that sea graphers are precise, but her eyes were now carrying something that looked a great deal like anger, the slow, controlled kind that comes from understanding rather than reaction. I will take the detour, she said. On the station appeared on their sensors 2 hours before they reached it, and it was not what Soren Cass had expected. He was not sure what he had expected. Something imposing, perhaps, something that communicated through its design the weight of what it represented, a large military installation, a fortress, something that looked like the home base of the most quietly feared civilization in the galaxy. What appeared on the screen was a station about the size of a modest trading post. No clean lines, practical design, nothing decorative about it. It sat exactly on the boundary, not inside human space, not outside it, precisely on the line that every chart in the galaxy marked with the same quiet dread, as if it had been placed there specifically to be findable from the outside without requiring anyone to cross over. There were 2 ships docked at it. Both of them were unlike anything in Soren Cass's reference database, not in a threatening way, just in the straightforward way of technology that had developed independently for a long time. Clean, efficient looking, no visible weapon ports, which either meant they had none or meant they had been designed by people who felt no need to display what they had. The station hailed them before they reached hailing distance by conclave standards, which meant their communication systems were considerably better than the standard, or they had been watching the approaching ship for a while or both. The voice that came through was speaking standard conclave trade language, which was the closest thing the galaxy had to a universal tongue. It was accented slightly, not in a way that suggested difficulty, more in the way of someone who had learned it from comprehensive study rather than immersive use, precise and pleasant. Seagraphy vessel from KTH Mara Central Station, welcome to the boundary. You are expected. Please dock at Bay 2. There is T. I looked at Soren Cass, though he looked back at her. There is T, she said in the tone of someone confirming that they had heard that correctly. There is T, he confirmed. They docked. The inside of the station was warm, not aggressively warm, just the particular warmth of a place that had been lived in and cared for, kind that accumulates from many meals cooked and many conversations had, many hours of people simply existing in a space comfortably. It smelled of something Soren Cass could not identify was something rich and slightly sweet, which he later learned was coffee. Human beverage with a long history and devoted following. Two humans met them at the airlock. One was a woman, tall by most species standards, with dark brown skin and gray threaded through her short hair, wearing a practical jacket with no insignia that Soren could read. She moved with the economy of motion of someone who had spent a great deal of time in low-gravity environments and had long since stopped noticing it. Her eyes were sharp and dark and looked at him with an attention that was not threatening but was absolute, the look of someone who was genuinely interested in what they were seeing. The other was a man somewhat shorter and with lighter skin and a beard and the kind of comfortable posture that suggested he was very rarely somewhere he did not want to be. He was carrying of all things a tray with cups on it. Soren cast. The woman said it was not a question. I am Commander Yara Solace. This is Dr. Patel, who insisted on the tea and will be disappointed if you do not at least try it. She glanced at a lot. We were not expecting to, but we are glad you brought someone. It is better to have a witness to what Sino said. She looked at him with something in her expression that he could not immediately name. It was not quite a smile. It was the expression of someone who had been waiting a long time for a specific kind of moment and had perhaps imagined it in many different ways and was now here in the actual moment of it and finding it to be different from all the imagined versions, quieter, smaller, more real. Caused to the end of a very long misunderstanding, she said. They sat in a room that had clearly been set up for exactly this kind of meeting, a round table, chairs that had been selected or modified to accommodate non-human proportions, a display wall that was currently blank. Dr. Patel distributed tea with the focused care of someone for whom this was genuinely important, and Soren Cass, out of courtesy, accepted a cup and drank from it. It was extraordinary. He noted this and filed it away as a fact that felt somehow significant, that the first thing a human had given him was something beautiful to drink. Commander Solace sat across from him and did not immediately speak. She looked at him for a moment in that same absolute way, and he had the distinct sense that she was deciding something, not about whether to tell him things he thought, but about how to begin, where to start a story that was very long and needed to be told in a way that would be understood. He decided to help. I read the archives, he said. The sealed records from the expansion era. I read 900 years of first contact logs. She nodded. We know we have very good monitoring systems. A pause. We were pleased. Most people who get that far read the early records and stop. They find the comfortable version and they keep it. You kept reading. You knew I was reading them while I was reading them, he said. Yes, you could have stopped me. We could have. She agreed. We decided not to. You were asking the right questions. We have been waiting for quite a long time for someone outside to start asking the right questions. He thought about something. The Dreth Raider, he said. The hard luck was that. Did you plan that? Something shifted in her expression. No, she said, that was genuine. A crew in real trouble who needed help. We helped them. She paused. But we did make a choice when we helped them to let the transmission go out unedited. We have always had the ability to intercept communications within our boundary. We chose not to. We wanted the Galaxy to hear what Vorax said because it would raise questions because someone needed to raise questions. She said, "We have been watching the silence hold for 400 years, and we have watched it get passed down and maintained and grow into something that had stopped being accurate a long time ago. We are a patient people, Saranas, but even we have limits." Olin, without speaking, said quietly, "Why did you agree to the silence in the first place, Commander?" Solace looked at her, something in her expression shifted, not quite pain but the cousin of it, something that came from a long memory. "We didn't," she said, "not entirely, not the way it became." She was quiet for a moment, choosing words. 400 years ago, there were conversations between human representatives and the elder nations. Very high level, very private. The elder nations came to us and said essentially that they were concerned about the rate of human expansion, the number of systems we were in, the influence we were developing. She paused. They were not entirely wrong to be concerned. We were everywhere. We were moving fast. Yeah, we were, some of us, not always being careful about how we moved. You agreed to pull back, Sina said. We agreed to a period of self-limitation. She said to step back, reassess, be more deliberate. It was our choice, a voluntary thing. We thought it would be a few generations, time to consolidate, to develop better protocols for contact and engagement, time to be more intentional. A pause. What we did not agree to was the myth, and the silence was supposed to be temporary and acknowledged. What the elder nations did afterward was let the silence become a story, and then they let the story grow. She looked at the table. By the time we understood how far the story had gotten, it had been 3 centuries. An entire galaxy of species had grown up, afraid of a shadow that we had no part in creating, and the elder nations who had created it were so invested in its maintenance, politically to strategically, that there was no clean way to dismantle it from the outside. So you waited, all said. We waited for someone to start pulling at the threads from the inside. Commander Solace confirmed. We waited for the question that would not go away. She looked at Scene Cass. We have been waiting for you specifically for about 6 months was since you walked into the navigation room on the Eternal Accord and started staring at the star charts. He felt a strange feeling move through him, not quite discomfort, something more like the vertigo of realizing that you had been watched, and watched kindly, for longer than you knew. What do you want, he said, from this meeting? What is it that you actually want? She reached into her jacket and placed something on the table, a data chip. Small, silver, unremarkable to look at. That, she said, contains 400 years of human scientific and medical research, engineering advances, navigation data, agricultural and environmental science, cultural records, philosophy, art. She slid it gently across the table toward him. It is a gift, not conditional, not in exchange for anything, not the beginning of a negotiation. She looked at him. We have been developing these things in our own space for 400 years because we had nothing better to do with our time, like we would like to share them freely with anyone who wants them. Soren Cass looked at the chip in the wall. He said, we are ready to come down from it, she said, on our terms, gradually, carefully, in ways that we can manage. We are not going to flood the galaxy with human ships tomorrow, but we are ready to begin. She paused. We wanted to tell someone directly first, before we make any broader Announcements. We wanted one person to understand the full story, what actually happened, why, what comes next. So that when the announcements come, there is someone who knows the context. Why me? He said, I am a junior aide. I have no authority, no platform. You have the truth, she said, and you have been leaving your communication channel open since you docked. He looked at his data pad, the communication channel he had opened before docking, a standard log transmission to Conclave Central, an automated record-keeping routine, the kind of thing that ran in the background of every official vessel by protocol, was still running. It had been broadcasting the entire conversation to the Conclave Central relay system. He looked up at Commander Solace. She looked back at him with that same expression, the one that was not quite a smile but was the territory beside a smile. The elder nations, she said, are going to have a very interesting afternoon outside the station's single observation window, where the stars were very bright and very still. On one side of the invisible line, human space stretched deep and vast and quiet. On the other side, the galaxy was already starting to react. He could see on his data pad the first acknowledgement signals coming back from the conclave relay, the first indication that someone at the other end had heard what had just been said. Soren Cass held the data chip in both hands. It was lighter than it should have been for what it contained. Siri, he thought about a galaxy that had walked in long arcs around a shadow for 300 years. He thought about trade routes that bent for weeks out of their way. He thought about 7 silent yearn scientists and a tired old historian and a navigator with her palms pressed flat to keep herself grounded. He thought about 9 dressed pirates in warm blankets and a smile at a refusal. He thought about the shape of something he had seen in the fog and had followed the way here. He tilted his head to the left. He looked at the data chip. He looked out at the stars. The gallery was very quiet. Dr. Patel was refilling cups without being asked, in the manner of someone who understood that the best thing to do with large moments was to keep the small kindnesses going. Soren Kaz drank his tea. The galaxy was about to have a very interesting afternoon. Indeed, the conclave did not move slowly this time. For an institution that had once spent 11 years debating the correct standard unit of measurement for interstellar distances, the speed at which the conclave responded to the broadcast from the boundary station was, in its own way, a kind of extraordinary event. Within 6 hours of the first acknowledgement signals coming back, Cass's data pad was receiving a volume of incoming messages that his notification system could not keep up with. Within 12 hours, but 3 separate emergency sessions had been called in the conclave chambers. Within 24 hours, the conversation that had been quietly, carefully avoided for 3 centuries was the only conversation happening anywhere in the galaxy. Soren Cass was still at the boundary station when most of this happened. He had not planned to stay, but Commander Solace had with calm practicality pointed out that being on a small vessel near the boundary was considerably safer than being at Conclave Central right now. Given what was unfolding there, Alit had agreed in the measured tones of someone who was trying very hard to remain calm, and largely succeeding. They stayed. Dr. Patel kept making tea. There was scene. Kaz was learning always tea. He had come to find this extraordinarily comforting. He watched the reaction spread from the small screen of his data pad, and it was like watching a stone hit water if the water were composed of the political structures of a dozen civilizations, and the stone were the truth. The first ring was disbelief. This was the fastest and most predictable reaction, and it burned out quickest. The broadcast had been clear and was already being replayed across every relay in the galaxy, and disbelief is a difficult position to maintain when the evidence is playing on a loop. People could choose not to believe it, but they could not choose not to have heard it. The second ring was anger. This one was louder and lasted longer. The anger was from what Soren Kaz could read in the public dispatches and news relays, not directed at humanity, not primarily. It was directed at something closer and more visible, the elder nations in the 4 centuries of manufactured silence. The KE government issued a statement within 18 hours. Our careful and qualified statement about the complexity of ancient decisions and the importance of historical context, and the statement was met with a fury that Soren Kaz could feel even through the screen of his data pad. Other species who had spent generations living around the edges of a fear they had never questioned were now with the abruptness of people who had just realized they had been deceived, very ready to talk about it. The third ring was quieter, and Sarana's thought more significant. It was the reaction that came after the noise, after the disbelief and the anger had worked through the loudest voices and started to settle. It came from the everyday people, the traders who had spent their careers mapping routes around a boundary, the families who had grown up with the rules so embedded in daily life that it had never once occurred to them to wonder about it. Teachers who had passed the warning on to 1,000 students. These people were not angry exactly. They were something harder to describe, something like the feeling you get when you have been carrying a heavy weight for so long that you have stopped noticing it, and someone takes it off your shoulders, and for a moment all you can feel is the absence of it, the strange lightness of a fear that had just quietly dissolved. Commander Salas watched the feat alongside him for part of the first day, and when she watched it she was very quiet. Her face held the expression of someone who was feeling many things simultaneously and was experienced enough to let them exist without naming all of them. Is it what you expected? He asked her at one point. She was quiet for a moment. We modeled many versions of this, she said. We have been thinking about it for a long time, the mechanics of it, how the information would spread, how different species would react, what the political implications would be in the first hours. It's the first days, the first years. She looked at the screen. The models were accurate, more or less. About the mechanics, a pause. The models did not capture this, though, the feeling of it. She stopped looking for a word. Relief, Al said quietly from across the room. Commander Salas looked at her. Yes, she said, the relief. On the second day, the conclave called for an emergency session of all senior representatives, and Soren Cass watched the notification come through on his data pad and felt the simultaneous awareness that he was being summoned, and that going back to Conclave Central right now would be, in practical terms, like walking directly into a fire. He was going to go anyway. He had not come this far by avoiding fires, but before he went, he had one more conversation With Commander Solace, he had been carrying a question since the previous day and had been turning it over, looking at its different sides, making sure he understood it before he asked, because it was the most important question and he wanted to ask it clearly. The things the elder nations did, he said, building the silence, maintaining it, keeping the rest of the galaxy afraid. Some of them did this knowing what the truth was. Some of them made this choice deliberately. Yes, she said they did it for political reasons, strategic reasons, to keep humanity at arm's length, to prevent dependence in, to maintain the balance they were comfortable with. Yes, they caused real harm, he said, not just the fear, real harm, trade routes that were longer than they needed to be, resources that were not shared that could have helped people, problems that could have been solved that were not, 400 years of things that did not happen because the galaxy was too afraid to cross a line. Yes, she said for the third time in the same tone, not defensive, not minimizing, and not looking away from what he was saying. What do you want to happen to them? He said, the elder nations, the ones who are still here, who are still benefiting from what their predecessors built. She looked at him. For a long time, that is not our decision to make, she said finally. Whatever justice looks like, if that is the right word, and I'm not sure it is, that is for the galaxy to work out, not for us. We are not coming back into the galaxy to settle old scores. When we are not coming back with grievances, she paused. We are coming back because it has been 400 years, and we have things to offer, and we have always been better at being part of things than we are at standing apart from them. Something shifted in her expression, a warmth, tired and real. We are going to be very annoying. Honestly, we are going to show up in places where people are struggling and try to help. We are going to make suggestions that nobody asked for, and we are going to learn everyone's languages imperfectly and ask too many questions and have too many opinions. She almost smiled. We have been very patient for 400 years. We have a lot of opinions saved up. He looked at her. He thought about 900 years of archive records, mediators who showed up uninvited, technicians who fixed drives without asking for payment, survey ships that shared data without negotiation, beings who arrived in the middle of conflicts, believing apparently and genuinely that it did not have to come to this. He thought about warm blankets, passed through an airlock in the dark. I think, he said slowly, that the galaxy is going to find you very surprising. She looked at him with that expression that lived beside a smile. We find that. That is usually how it goes, she said. He went back to Conclave Central. Olette flew him. They did not talk much on the way, and they were both carrying a lot of thoughts and had the kind of comfortable mutual respect that made silence easy rather than awkward. When they docked and the station felt different from how he had left it, the difference was hard to name precisely. Nothing had physically changed. The corridors were the same, the lights were the same, the smell of recycled air and machinery was the same. But the quality of the people moving through those corridors had changed. One of they moved with the particular restlessness of people who were in the middle of rethinking something large. Conversations were happening everywhere, in small groups, in corridors and in the cafeteria and in doorways, the kind of conversations that do not care about where they happen because the people having them cannot wait to have them. The elder ambassadors were already in Session. When he arrived, he did not attempt to attend the session directly. He did not have the standing for it, and the guards at the chamber doors were in any case not letting anyone in who was not on the pre-approved list. Instead, he went to his small office and sat down and turned on his data pad and watched the public feed from outside the chamber. Several hundred conclave staff members were watching the same feed from their own locations across the station, and this shared watching had produced a particular atmosphere, tense, expectant. You know, the kind of collective attention that happens when something large is in the process of being decided. Lethnaran, the KE ambassador, spoke first. Soren Cass had watched this man in sessions many times over 2 cycles. He had always projected a quality of settled certainty, the kind that comes from years of authority and the deeply held belief that one is fundamentally doing the right thing. Today he did not have that quality, and he looked like a person who was very tired and had decided that the most dignified thing he could do was to stop pretending. He did not confess exactly. He did not lay out the history the way Soren Cass had laid it out in his conversation with a lot. He spoke in the measured language of diplomacy, which was the language he had used his entire life, and which he was constitutionally unable to fully abandon even now. But within that measured language he said clearly and without qualification, and that historical decisions had been made with regard to human space that had not been transparent to the wider galactic community, that those decisions had had consequences that extended well beyond what had been intended, that the KE government acknowledged this and was prepared to participate in a full review of the historical record. It was not an apology, it was the structure that an apology would be built on, which was perhaps the most that centuries of political habit could produce in a single session. The year representative followed, then the delegation, each in their own diplomatic language, each acknowledging the shape of the same truth without quite being willing to say it plainly. The session was not a reckoning, not yet. It was the beginning of a process that would take years, probably, and would be difficult and would involve many more sessions and many more conversations and a great deal of the painstaking, frustrating, occasionally maddening work of actual accountability. Soren Cass watched all of it. He took notes. He would in the coming weeks be asked to write a formal account of his actions and his findings for the conclave record, and he would write it carefully and completely, including the methods he had used to access the classified files, because he had decided that if the moment called for honesty, then the honesty had to be complete. He expected to be disciplined for the archive access. He was prepared for that. He was not prepared for the conclave to present him 6 weeks later with a formal letter of recognition for his role in the events of that period, signed by representatives of 11 species. But that was what happened, and it was one of the stranger days of his life. And the announcement that came from human space 30 days later was carried on every relay in the galaxy. It was not long. Humanity had apparently decided, after 400 years of having opinions saved up, that the first public address to the galaxy did not need to be extensive. It was 3 paragraphs. It was warm and direct and written in the kind of language that was designed not to impress but to be understood. It said that humanity was ready to reopen contact, that they had been watching the recent events with interest and with. They admitted some relief that the truth had finally found its way out, that they understood the process of rebuilding. Trust would be long and that they had no expectation of it being easy or immediate, that they were prepared to be patient because patience was something. They said with a kind of dry humor that was apparently characteristic. Reasonably good at uns said that the data contained in the chip Commander Souls had given Soren Cass, which he had long since transmitted to the Conclave. Science Division was freely available to any species that wanted it with no conditions attached and no expectations of anything in return. It ended with a sentence that Soren Cass read several times, not because he did not understand it, but because he wanted to keep understanding it, to let the weight of it land properly each time. Alcron had said, "We have always been better at being neighbors than at being legends, and we would very much like to be neighbors again." He read it the first time in his office alone and sat with it. He read it the second time aloud to Alat, who was sitting across from him, eating lunch, and who put down her fork and was quiet for a moment before saying, in a measured voice, that it was a very good sentence. He read it the third time to old Bess Terrell Hunt, whom he visited that evening in her small suite near the garden level. She listened to it with her eyes closed and her hands folded in her lap, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "Well," she said at last, "it took long enough." He looked at her. She was smiling, small and tired and real. She looked, he thought, like someone who had been waiting for the end of a very long story and had finally heard it. In the months that followed, the galaxy changed, not all at once, not in the dramatic way of wars or disasters which remake things suddenly and violently. It changed in the slower, more durable way of things that have been understood differently. The way a piece of music changes when you finally understand what the composer was trying to say, or the way a scar changes when someone finally tells you how it happened. Trade routes were remapped. They were shorter now, most of them. The long arc straightened to ships that had been making week-so-long detours began to plot direct courses, and the first time a vessel from Conclave Central charted a route straight through what had been marked human space and came out the other side with nothing more eventful to report than a pleasant exchange with a human patrol vessel who had guided them through the busy inner lanes. The pilot's account was read by approximately 4 million people across 12 species. In the first day, human ships began to appear so carefully and gradually at the edges of galactic space, not fleets, individual vessels, mostly scientists, merchants, people who had apparently spent a very long time wanting to see the places they had been maps of for 400 years. They were, as Commander Solace had predicted, with what Scene-Cast now understood was not quite humility, but accurate self-knowledge, somewhat overwhelming their enthusiasm. They asked a great many questions. They offered help at a rate that some species found charming and others found exhausting, and most found eventually both at once. The data chip's contents were distributed across the Conclave's science networks, and the medical advances alone. There had been 4 centuries of unshared human medical research produced applications that were implemented on dozens of worlds within the first year. The number of lives this saved was not a number that Soren Ka ever saw properly calculated, was because it was too large and 2 spread out to calculate cleanly. But the estimate that the science division produced was a number he thought about for a long time. He thought about it the way you think about the shape of something enormous that you can only understand in pieces. He thought about what 400 years of fear had cost in roots that were longer than they needed to be, in knowledge that had not been shared, in problems that had gone unsolved. He thought about this without anger, mostly because anger about something that was over was an expensive thing to carry, and he had learned from watching people who carried it that the expense was rarely worth the payment. But he thought about it, and he thought about Bistal, who had handed him a number on a piece of physical paper and said, "Go find out what happened in Thessus," who had looked at a small blue plant and told him a story about 7 scientists who came home silent, and navigator Peleris, who had pressed her palms flat against the navigation console and closed her eyes, and who he had looked up recently and discovered had requested a transfer to new posting on a long-range survey vessel that would, according to its route, pass through human space. He thought about Vorek, the Dreth captain of the Hard Luck, who had given an interview to 3 different news relays and had said in each of them how, with the consistent conviction of someone whose entire understanding of the universe had been rearranged and who had no intention of going back, they fixed my drive and gave us blankets. That is all I know. That is all anyone needs to know. He thought about Commander Yara Solis and her absolute attention and her almost smile and the patience of 400 years sitting behind her eyes like something that had been given enough time to become very strong. He was sitting in the station's small garden when he thought all of these things. It was late in the station's day cycle, and most people had gone to their quarters. The plants moved gently in the recycled air. The strange mixed smell of a dozen different worlds drifted around him, comfortable and strange and familiar all at once. His data pad buzzed. He looked at it. A message from Commander Solis, short as her messages tended to be, on which we are opening a permanent liaison station at the inner boundary next month. We would like a conclave representative to be present at the opening, preferably one who asked the right questions. We have good coffee. Interested? He read it twice. He set the data pad down on his knee. Outside the garden, small transparent panels. The stars were very bright. Some of them were stars he now knew the names of, systems that had been marked human space on every map for 3 centuries, and were now gradually and carefully becoming just places, stars with planets around them, planets with people on them, people who had been patient for a very long time and were at last ready to be neighbors again. Soren Ka tilted his head to the left. He picked up the data pad. He wrote back, yes, 1 word. Shortest possible answer to the question, but it was the right answer. And it was the honest one, and it was the beginning of something that would take a very long time and be very complicated and occasionally very difficult, and would require at every step the particular kind of courage that is not dramatic or visible. The courage of continuing to ask questions even when the answers are uncomfortable, and of sitting with the truth once you have found it, and of believing even when it seems unlikely that things can be different from how they have been. He sent the message, and the plants moved in the recycled air. The stars were very bright. The galaxy was not the same as It was not simpler. If anything, it was more complicated now, with all the complexity that honesty brings when it replaces a story that had been comfortable in its falseness. It was harder in some ways. It was going to require work, but it was more true. And Soren Cass, who had always believed that true was better than comfortable, but sat in the garden with the mixed smell of a dozen worlds around him and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the shape of things made sense. He went asleep that night without his head tilting to the left,